Good evening and welcome to tonight's Monday night seminar here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York. I'm Gus Axelson. I'm the editorial director here at the Cornell Lab. And probably not surprisingly, I'm also a big fan of science and nature writing, especially about birds. One of the perks of my job is that I get to be the editor of Living Bird magazine. And so that means that I get to indulge my fandom and stalk my favorite writers. When I became editor a couple years ago, the first writer I stalked was Scott Weidensaul, because I've been a huge fan of his since his book Living on the Wind, which was, I'm sure all of you have read, and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in the year 2000. In that book, Scott wrote about a time he was in the rainforest in Belize, and he was surrounded by a cascade of Baltimore orioles. And he talked about the magic of this moment of seeing these birds that he would see atop red maple trees in his native Pennsylvania, and seeing them share trees with toucans and motmots and parrots. It was that chapter that inspired me to travel neotropical migrant birds down to Colombia and write a story about shade-grown coffee and bird conservation. And I'm sure that Scott's writing has inspired many of you as well. Scott is a former newspaper journalist who has written more than 24 books. He also writes for many magazines, including Audubon, Birdwatcher's Digest, National Wildlife Magazine, and Our Own Living Bird. Scott is also an active field researcher who co-directs a collaborative effort among nearly 125 banding and research stations across North America. And he also runs his own field research station studying the migration of northern saw-whet owls. And in fact, just last night, he was working at his banding station, had some saw-whet owls, and that's another story that he's working on for the next autumn issue of Living Bird. He also co-directs Project Snowstorm, which tracks the movements of snowy owls in winter. Scott is currently working on a sequel to Living on the Wind, a book that will look at the great bird migrations around the world. And in the summer issue of Living Bird, he wrote a story for us about the epic migration of Amur falcons through remote northeastern India. That material will be a chapter in his new book, and he's here tonight to tell us more about his first-hand experience with the great Amur falcon migration. Scott?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gus. It is always a pleasure and an honor to be here. I was actually an art major in college because I wanted to be a bird artist, and so every time I have an opportunity to stand here surrounded by these incredible Fuertes paintings and walk up and down the halls of the lab surrounded by all this incredible art, I am overcome with two emotions. One is, kind of wish I'd stuck with the art stuff a little better. The other is a profound urge to commit larceny. So if you notice bare spots on the wall, don't tell them for a while. I'd like to, as Gus said, I'd like to talk to you a little bit tonight about Amur falcons and this arguably the greatest concentration of raptors on Earth, which we knew nothing about until just a couple of years ago. And this is the first time I'm doing this program, so if it's a little rough and rocky tonight, give me some slack. I've been messing around with birds all my life. I grew up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, very close to Hawk Mountain. I got started doing raptor banding back in the 1980s, then shifted into owls, and then hummingbirds and songbirds. And as Gus said, back in the late 90s, I spent 6 years overall, 3 years pretty much continuously tracking bird migration up and down the Western Hemisphere for Living on the Wind, which focused on bird migration in the Western Hemisphere. But it's been 20 years since the book came out, and we've learned a lot more about migration since then. We've learned more about the science of migration. We've learned more about the challenges that are facing migratory birds. The technology by which we're studying migration has changed dramatically. So as Gus said, I'm working on what, in some respects, is a sequel to Living on the Wind. It's a book that's going to be called A World of Wings. It'll be coming out in 2020 from Norton, because the world is alive with bird migration. It's arguably the greatest natural phenomenon on the planet. And so for the last 2.5 years, I've been zigzagging back and forth across the globe, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but worldwide, chasing pelagic birds in the Pacific and in the Bering Strait, in the Bering Sea, and off the Atlantic. This spring, in part for Living Bird, I was over on the Yellow Sea in China, where some 11 million migratory shorebirds funnel through from places as far-flung as Australia and New Zealand on their way to Alaska or Siberia, but in a place where 60 or 70% of the tidal wetlands on which these birds depend have already been destroyed in China and the Koreas. And so I was spending time in the field with an international cadre of shorebird biologists, people like Tunis Piersma from the Netherlands, and Jing Li from China with the spoonbill sandpiper in China nonprofit. People working with community leaders and government officials and common citizens and school kids trying to protect what is left of the coastal wetlands in China for this enormous hemispheric migration of birds that pass through there. I spent time in the Bahamas. Yeah, it was work. I was in the Bahamas, but it was work. Never went near a beach. With Nathan Cooper from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, who's using one of these new forms of technology called nanotag transmitters. Tiny transmitters that are small enough now you can put them on butterflies and dragonflies, but are finally allowing us to track birds the size of endangered Kirtland's warblers on their migration from the Bahamas up to their breeding grounds in Michigan. And I just got back about 2 weeks ago from the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean, where Cyprus is kind of the worst of the worst in the Mediterranean in terms of illegal bird killing. Every year between 11 and 36 million songbirds are killed and eaten for food in the Mediterranean, including about 2.5 million in Cyprus. But the Cypriot police, the British military police on some of the big military bases there are really cracking down on this. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has given them two $20,000 sophisticated drones that they can send up in the night sky with infrared to find the bird trappers when they're setting up their nets at night. The RSPP actually sends down wildlife crime specialists that are out there in these sniper ghillie suits, tracking these guys down, making a significant dent in illegal bird killing. But it can be kind of grim, It's the stories about bird migration these days can be fairly depressing. We're at a tipping point for many migratory populations. All of the stresses that modern humanity has brought to bear, from climate change to habitat loss to pesticides to poaching and netting and illegal killing to windows to turbines to cats, are all having an effect on birds. And so it's rare when you find a story that encapsulates many of those difficulties and challenges, but you come out the other end in an optimistic frame of mind. And so what I'd like to do this evening is take you to one of the more remote parts of Asia, certainly one of the most remote parts of the world I've ever been to. It's a place called Nagaland in northeastern India. It's that little bit of India that sticks up like a finger to the northeast between, whether you want to call it Myanmar or Burma on the south and China to the north. It's rugged, it's mountainous, it's relatively lightly populated, and every year millions of Amur falcons gather there on their migration. Amur falcons are a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger than an American kestrel. They're a largely insectivorous falcon. They breed in northern China, northeastern China, southern Siberia. And that doesn't look particularly large on this map, but it's actually hundreds of thousands of square miles of breeding range. And then every year in autumn, they take off on one of, if not the longest migrations of any raptor on Earth. They hook south, kind of around the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas. I mean, you got to be nuts to fly across the Himalayas. There's a few birds that do it, but the falcons don't. Because they feed on insects, they stay mostly in the lowlands, and then they stage up in northeastern India in late October and early November. And they time their arrival with the end of the monsoon season and then the emergence of subterranean termites. Now, these are not the termites that make the big mounds like you'll see in Africa or Australia. They're hidden underground, but after the monsoons are over, when the ground is still moist, the termites will chew their way up to the surface, and the alates, the fertile winged females and males, will emerge on these mating flights by the trillions, and they're big and they're fat and they're juicy, and they're the perfect food for a falcon that's got a long way to go. Because after they've gorged themselves on termites and laid on a tremendous amount of fat, what these birds do is they make the longest overwater crossing of any raptor that we're aware of. They fly 2,400 miles nonstop across the Indian Ocean and down to spend the winter in southern Africa, in South Africa and some of the neighboring countries. And all their annual migration is about 18,000 miles a year. The only other raptor that even comes close is the Swainson's hawk here in North America. And the area where these birds gather in huge numbers in October and November is centered on Nagaland. So I'm just going to zoom in here. This is a somewhat troubled part of the world. If you've been paying attention to the news out of Myanmar, you know that. And also, if you look at Google Earth, you see all those red lines. Those are contested boundaries. India and China went to war in the 1960s over some of this territory, and there's still an awful lot of tension in that area. Nagaland is ruggedly mountainous. It is largely undeveloped. It is the defiantly un-Indian part of India. It is not ethnically Indian. It is an officially English-speaking state. It is 95% Baptist. We can get into that yet. It's an odd little corner of India. And in fact, you can see the boundary between Nagaland and the neighboring state of Assam from space, because literally where the pancake flat rice paddies of Assam end and the hills start to go up, it's the only border I've ever seen that precisely follows a topographic line on a map. And whereas the Assamese lowlands are mostly cleared, and as I said, mostly rice, the hills in Nagaland are densely forested. So the center of our focus tonight is a little tiny village called Pangti, which is about halfway between the Assam border and the border of Myanmar. In 2000, the Indian government opened a hydroelectric dam that they built on the Doyang River. And something odd happened, and we're not really quite sure what did this, why this happened, but when they built the dam, the falcons that were always traditionally coming through that part of northeastern India began gathering in huge numbers in enormous roosts along the banks of the Doyang Reservoir. Something about the microclimate, something about safety and security, maybe they just like the water view, I don't really know. But they started gathering by the tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands in enormous roosts. Amur falcons are social migrants, like Swainson's hawks, like broad-winged hawks here in North America. They travel in immense flocks. They gather both in migration and on the wintering grounds in immense flocks. In 2012, actually a year or two before that, a woman named Banu Haralu, that's Banu over there on the right. Banu's a former television journalist. She grew up in Nagaland, made a rather spectacular career for herself elsewhere in northeastern India, but she'd come back to Nagaland and founded a small wildlife and biodiversity conservation trust there. And she'd been hearing rumors about large numbers of falcons in Nagaland and hearing disturbing rumors that many of these falcons were being killed. So in the fall of 2012, she and several of her colleagues, including some folks from, let me just bring up their names there, some folks from Conservation India, which was another fairly newly formed NGO, decided to go in and investigate. And what they found absolutely horrified them. And they produced a video. I'm just going to play a few clips with no audio from this to give you a sense of what they found. What they found was that the fishermen in Nagaland, particularly from this village of Pangti, were repurposing their fishing nets to start catching falcons. And they were catching something on the order of 140,000 falcons during the roughly 10-day peak of the migration in the middle of the fall. They were catching these birds, they were killing them, they were smoking them, and they were eating them themselves. And I recognize these are disturbing images, and I apologize for that, but I think it's necessary for you to understand the scope and the scale of what was going on here. They were primarily selling these in other villages in some of the larger towns and cities elsewhere in Nagaland, and for fairly desperately needed cash. A lot of the families were selling these birds to pay for their kids' school fees. Well, the word got out about this, and many of you, because we've got a lot of bird conservationists in the crowd here, you probably heard about this in the fall of 2012. There was international outrage and concern because, Amur falcons are a fairly common raptor, but they're not that common, and 140,000, and that's a conservative estimate because that was what they calculated during the roughly 10-day peak of the migration. These birds are there, some of them are there for almost 2 months, and it's probably more on the order of 200,000 to 250,000 birds a year that were being killed. That's unsustainable. The population would not have been able to sustain that for very long. So there was outrage from around the world. And usually when something like this happens, there's kind of a predictable script that we follow. There's outrage. There's people try to change it. There's pushback from the local community. This can go on for years. It becomes almost a battle of wills. That didn't happen in Nagaland. Instead, conservationists like those from Conservation India, from the Nagaland Biodiversity and Wildlife Trust, from BirdLife International, from a host of different agencies and NGOs came in, worked with the local community, and explained to them what the ramifications of this were. And, the Naga saw this enormous multitude of birds come down every year. When they built the reservoir, the government flooded their farmland. The Naga communities are on mountaintops for defense, as you'll hear in a little bit, and their fields are all in the valleys. And so they lost their farmland. They tried farming on the hillsides. It's not very productive land, and the wild elephants destroyed their crops. They tried to make a living as fishermen, but the government didn't cut the trees down in the reservoir before they flooded it. So it's difficult to fish basically in a sunken forest. And they're all good Baptists, and this looked like manna from heaven, literally manna from heaven, like God was providing these birds for them. And when they found out that these birds were traveling such an enormous distance, that their depredations on these birds were endangering their survival, and it also has to be said that when they were informed by the government that this was illegal and they were not going to tolerate it anymore, they stopped. Literally, from 1 year to the next, they went from 140,000 dead falcons in 2012 to probably a couple hundred in 2013, and not a single falcon since then has been taken. And these communities, especially Pangti, have embraced they've embraced falcon conservation with what I might call an evangelical fervor. Hundreds of the former trappers have formed the Amur Falcon Roosting Area Union. They are now guides and guards. They've built watchtowers near the roost sites with the idea that tourists would come in here and replace the income that they used to get from selling and killing these falcons from people coming in to view them. And in a matter of just a couple of years, the story out of Nagaland has changed dramatically. Falcon hunters become fervent preservationists, says the New York Times, the newspaper of record. It's an extraordinary story, but it's also an extraordinarily difficult place to get to. And tourists have been pretty thin on the land in Nagaland. And so my curiosity was, what happens when really poor people do a really hard thing for the right reason, but expecting a certain outcome? What happens when that outcome may be slow to materialize or may not materialize at all? And so for the last 2 years, well, actually 2 years prior, been trying to figure out a way to get myself over to Nagaland. This is not, as I said, this is not an easy place to get to. It's not an entirely safe place to get to. Nagaland is the site of the longest-running guerrilla war in Asia. Since the 1940s, there have been separatist groups and breakaway insurgencies. They've been trying to break Nagaland away from India. there are still cross-border insurgents coming in from Myanmar. The weird thing about Nagaland is that even the Maoist guerrillas coming in from Myanmar are mostly Baptists. It's an odd place. But it's, when we were planning our trip to Nagaland for last year, we were told repeatedly, do not be on the road after dark. But my good friend Kevin Lachlan, who runs Wildside Nature Tours, he's been doing ecotourism stuff for years. When Kevin found out about Nagaland and found out about how important ecotourism was going to be to making a success for falcon conservation there, he and I started plotting to find out, is it possible for American ecotour companies, bird tour companies, to take groups into Nagaland to see this incredible spectacle of, somewhere between 1 and 3 million Amur falcons gathered in one spot for an extended period of time in the fall? Is it possible to safely and efficiently bring tourists in there to pump a little money into the economy? So last year, we took a group of guinea pigs in on an exploratory expedition. In addition to Kevin and me, we had my friend Catherine Hamilton. Many of you are familiar with Catherine's work. She's a superb bird artist living in California. Her participation was underwritten in part by Zeiss. Peter Trueblood, who's gone on a bunch of Kevin's expeditions and is up for an adventure, and he and his cousin Bruce Evans from Maryland decided that they would be paying guinea pigs on this trip, that they would help underwrite the costs of this exploratory expedition so that they could be among the first ones going in there. I don't think they regretted it, although there may have been a couple of times. Getting to Pang Ti is not easy. That's the main road through Nagaland. We were not going to be on the main road for much of the time. That's what the main road looks like in places. Mostly the main road looks like that. Now I have to say that last year, we headed in there toward the end of October. Last year, the monsoon rains continued weeks and weeks and weeks later than they normally do. And so the roads were in even worse condition than usual. But the roads in Nagaland are some of the worst roads on the planet. It's not just that they're muddy and there's traffic jams. And in some places you actually have to drive through active landslide zones where the side of the mountain slips away and they just bring in a bulldozer and push another road across it, and they use that until that slips away. And as we're driving, and you can't really see that continues considerably farther down from out of the picture, that the road was actually shaking and quivering as we were going across it. It's a bone-jarring, tooth-rattling 8 or 10 or 12 hours to get back into Pang Ti. We finally found ourselves at the Doyang Reservoir, which is where these falcons gather. 2 years we've been planning this. 2 years we've been dreaming about getting to the Doyang Reservoir and seeing the sky alive with falcons. And on the drive-in we saw 4. Not 400,000, not 4,000, 4. We figured they just must be somewhere else. We finally made it into Pang Ti. The Naga live in these hill communities. Until just a generation or so ago, many Naga communities were still active headhunters, and they fought with each other. There are, depending on how you characterize a tribe, there are anywhere from 30 to more than 100 different tribal differentiations in Nagaland, many of them speaking mutually unintelligible dialects, and for time out of mind, fighting with each other, attacking each other, taking heads from each other. Yes, Baptist headhunters, I know it is strange. I mentioned that the Naga are not ethnically Indian, they're a Tibeto-Burmese ethnic group. Look, and the moment you drive across the border out of Assam, where the signs are all in Hindi, and there's Hindu iconography everywhere. The moment you cross the bridge into Nagaland, the people look different, they sound different. All the signs are in English. Everybody dresses differently. It is like going from one country to the next. And the Naga, most of them would prefer that to be the case. We were staying with. There's no tourist facilities in Pang Ti. Catherine was told repeatedly that she was the first Western woman they had ever seen in the village. They were not as excited about us guys because during World War II there were British Army officers there, so we were kind of old hat. And I don't want to convey the sense that this is some, primitive village. They've got electricity, they've got cell phones, some of the houses have television, but getting there is really difficult, and almost nobody from outside ever goes there. So because there's no tourist facilities, we were just staying with a local school teacher and his wife. They had converted part of their house into a homestay in anticipation of tourists coming. They had installed a Western-style toilet out in the back with it wasn't flush toilet, but at least it was a seat to sit on. We had just absolutely delicious food out of their very traditional Naga open fire kitchen, fish and chicken and smoked beef. Every house in the above this open wood fire, they have racks of bamboo racks on which beef will season and smoke for weeks or months or years at a time. It was incredibly good food. We did discover, however, that the Naga do not use mattresses. And so for the week or so that we were in Pang Ti, it was very kind. The Sopo family moved out and let us move in, but we were sleeping on hard wooden beds. So, note to self, if you're taking in American tourists, take mattresses. We got there just at sunset the first evening, made it just in time, and as we were eating our dinner, they brought a couple of the young men who were part of this roost site union, some of the young guides to come in, and of course the first question we asked them is, how many falcons are here? And they said, 2,000, and we said, I'm sorry, 1 or 2,000? Yes, 2,000. We spent 2 years and a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort to come see the greatest raptor concentration on Earth, and then 1 or 2,000 is not going to cut it. It was crushing. It was absolutely crushing news. But we got up at 3 o'clock the next morning and loaded up into our vehicles to drive down to a watchtower that was built near one of the roost sites. And it was actually very cool. As we're walking through the darkness, we could hear the trumpeting of wild elephants in the distance, and we could hear the rustle of wind blowing through the bamboo fronds as we climbed up into the tower. It was still almost completely pitch black, but Catherine raised her binoculars and looked out and gasped and said, "Oh my God, look," because the sky was absolutely covered with birds. There weren't 1 or 2,000 falcons. There were probably 50 or 60,000 falcons. We never figured out if it was a lapse in translation, or if it was simply because these birds had just come in. I mean, this extremely late monsoon season had delayed the migration significantly, and so these birds came whirling up. The sound, what we thought was the sound of wind blowing through the bamboo, was actually the sound of tens of thousands of these falcons coming off the roost in wave after wave after wave, and then heading out. They would start to thermal up, heading out to hunt for the day, and each time you'd get one of these massive waves of falcons coming up, we'd think, well, that's done it. That's emptied the trees. And then we'd put our spotting scopes up and we'd realize that and these birds are coming out of like maybe 2.5 or 3 hectares of forest, very tiny little patch of forest that they were dense. The trees were still dripping with falcons. It was an extraordinary thing. I've seen some of the world's greatest concentrations of raptors. I was part of a team in 1992 that first documented the river of raptors in Veracruz, Mexico. 4.5 million raptors migrating through there every year. But there's no place else on Earth where these birds come in such concentrations day after day after day. I mean, at Veracruz, the birds they're passing through on migration. Over the course of the fall, you get 4+ million birds, but in Nagaland, they're there in these extraordinary numbers, as I say, just day after day after day. So, just to give you a little primer again on Amur falcons, the juveniles and the females are barred. The males are these absolutely gorgeous gray birds, red, sort of rufous down on the thighs. Until relatively recently, they were considered conspecific with red-footed falcons, which breed a bit farther west in Eurasia. but they've been split off on their own species. We were interested, obviously, not just in falcons and not just the spectacle, but it's fair to say we saw fewer birds than we thought we would. Nagaland is densely forested, but it's almost all fairly young second-growth forest. They grow a lot of teak in Nagaland, and so a lot of the forest is constantly being cut, planted with teak. The teak grows up, they cut it down. There's also a tradition of slash-and-burn agriculture there, and the rotational speeds have accelerated over the years, so the forest doesn't get as much of an opportunity to recover as it did. But and we're also there in November. We were not there at the prime time of the year for birding, but we had a lot of other terrific South Asian specialties like black drongo. This is an immature black drongo, long-tailed shrikes, and an extraordinary diversity of butterflies. We're kind of blown away by the butterfly diversity in this part of Asia. We spent more time probably looking at butterflies than we did at birds. And part of the reason for that is the Naga love to hunt, and they hunt everything. That's one of the differences about the rest of India, Assam, for example, and Nagaland, is as soon as you cross the border into Nagaland, almost every guy you see over the age of 16 has a shotgun or an air rifle or a light caliber .22 rifle over his shoulder. Every kid under the age of 16 has a slingshot, and some of them, like this guy, have both. And particularly around the villages, the birds are just scarce. They simply eat them all. It's been a real problem. One of the things that the falcon conservation push has done is start to generate a conversation among the Naga communities about conservation in general. A lot of the big game is gone. The last tiger that they've seen in Nagaland was about 15 years ago. They had one that showed up there last year and was almost immediately shot. There are still wild elephants. There's still barking deer. There's a number of species, but it's not what it could be given how lightly populated Nagaland is and how relatively forested it is. When you go into the villages, you'll often see skulls. This is a mithun, which are the large semi-domestic cattle, the native cattle to that area. Barking deer are still fairly common, and every house has barking deer skulls hanging up, both as hunting trophies, but it's also a good luck charm there. This is Pang Ti. The Baptist church dominates the community. It's about 500 households. And as I said, as with all of these Naga communities, they're high up on mountaintops. I mean, Pang Ti has been there for many, many, many generations. And, 50 or 60 years ago, there was still village-to-village warfare going on there. The architecture is typical Tibeto-Burmese architecture. They love flowers. It's quite a beautiful community, a very welcoming community. One of the things I found entrancing was getting to. Yeah, I love this picture. A lot of these photographs are Kevin Laughlin's, by the way. So I know the credit line is there, but I want to give Kevin a shout out for them. And this is a typical. A typical Naga home, open hearth fire, dirt floor. But there are also homes in the community that are thoroughly modern construction with, the whole village is electrified. That's one of the advantages of having a hydroelectric dam built fairly close by. Our host was anxious to introduce us to his parents. His mother is 98 years old and blind. His father is 102, was a famous tiger hunter in his day. During World War II, he worked with the British when they were fighting the Japanese invasion into India, and in fact, his father still keeps his tiger spear handy. You can't really see it in this picture, but his right hand has these massive scars on it. He got jumped by a tiger when he was in the forest one day and killed it with his machete. Interesting guy. Mr. Sopo was very proud of his father's a lot of his father's hunting trophies. Most of these were taken with spear. When you walk through the village, the tradition there is to bury your family dead in the courtyard of the house, and so a lot of homes have tombstones. This was I'm not sure how well you can see that. But this gentleman died in 1947, and he killed 4 tigers, 2 leopards, an elephant, and he took 6 human heads. He was alive during World War II. It's possible that that those were Japanese heads. The Battle of Kohima, there was a lot of Japanese were killed. They're buried in the war cemetery there. The joke I heard was, well, there's X number of Japanese bodies in that cemetery, but there's not X number of Japanese heads in that cemetery. The Naga today are reluctant to talk about headhunting. It's not in keeping with their Baptist tradition, although it was for a long time. The American Baptist missionaries came to Nagaland in the 1850s, 1860s, I forget exactly when, and established a presence there. But they made only modest inroads through much of the 20th century. But after Indian independence, the Indian government kicked foreign missionaries out, and the Naga sort of took that, like, okay, you're gonna kick our missionaries out. All right, we're gonna become Baptist, and that was the point where conversion rates skyrocketed. Like I said, they've been defiantly un-Indian for a very long time. I found them understandably reluctant to want to talk about their headhunting past, but until fairly recently, almost all the homes would have displayed trophies, or there would have been a special house in the village where war trophies would have been displayed. Each village has its own colors, its own traditional dress. We had an opportunity to visit with some of the women in Pang Ti one day, and I've got a little video here. They were grinding rice, and they use a traditional mortar and pestle, and it's a little bit like Scottish walking songs where you keep the rhythm for the work by singing. That's what they do here as well. So there's hard-hulled rice in those pestles. They invited me to try. There's no way I was going to be able to do that in time. And those are heavy posts as well. They're 7-8 feet tall, probably 5 or 6 feet in diameter, probably weigh about 25 pounds or so. You get a workout, and then after the rice has been ground, then it has to be sifted, and then there's always, that's what it looks like when it comes out of the pestle, and there's always somebody around to pick up the scraps. So, as I said, one of the things I was interested in is what happens when folks who don't have a lot do something difficult and really take a hit for it. The money that people were making selling falcons, most of the families that I talked to used that money to pay their children's school fees. In many parts of India, you have to pay for your kids' education. And it's not cheap, especially in a place like this where higher education, they have to be, for like at some of the higher primary grades, they have to be sent to boarding schools in the larger towns or villages. During the days of the falcon harvest, and this really only lasted for a few years. I mean, they started catching falcons in the early 2000s. It peaked around 2010, 2012, and then went away. But during that period, almost everybody in the village had some sort of a hand in this. They were either trapping the falcons, or they were processing the falcons, or they were taking them to the cities to sell them. Almost everybody benefited financially from that. Now that the focus is on tourism, there's a lot more income inequality. There's a lot more inequity. For some of the people, like in Chomo, who was a falcon trapper, he's now a guide, and he's a remarkably skilled birder, as most people who live close to the land and spend every day out in the forest are. But he's really embraced this. He's learning the English names for the birds. He wants to learn butterfly identification, bird identification. In fact, we left him a copy of Field Guide to the Birds of India, so he could start to learn the English names for these birds, not just the local names for the birds. So he's making money, taking tourists out, guiding them for birds, which is important because some of Nchomo's kids are in boarding school, and this is expensive, and he really financially misses the money that they made from this relatively brief period every year during the falcon harvest. A relative of his owns the property where one of these large roost sites is, and so he invested in building a watchtower, and every day when tourists come there, they pay a small fee to enter the property. So, there's money that the guides get, there's money that the landowners get. This is the landowner right here. Now, not everybody is necessarily connecting the dots. The roost where the birds actually spend the night, this forest, last year when we went there, he'd cut down about a quarter of the trees in that roost because it was time to plant that area with teak. Always done that. That's how you make money. I don't know that he'd really quite connected the dots that if you cut down that roost site, those birds that people are paying to come see will go somewhere else. So we had a fairly urgent conversation with him about that. Some of the families in the village, like the family we were staying with, had enough cash on hand to invest in the facilities they needed to turn their homes into homestays so that when visitors came, they could stay with them. But, there's 500 households in Pangti, and so far as I think 3 of them have set up homestays. So one of the really pressing questions over there, and I don't have an answer for this, is how they're going to be able to share the wealth equitably so that there isn't a building resentment on the part of the rest of the community that they've given up this ready source of income for the benefit of a relatively smaller number of people in the community. What they did have going for them in terms of falcon conservation is this was not a traditional hunt. I mentioned I was just in Cyprus where they catch 2.5 million songbirds a year because it's a tradition in much of the Mediterranean, in Italy, in France, in Malta, to eat small songbirds. And trying to get past that tradition is really difficult. This was not a tradition. And once they understood how dangerous it was for the birds, they were willing to step away from it. But, the fact of the matter is, more of the people in these communities need to make money from falcons so that they embrace this notion of conservation. Which brings us to one of the weirdest aspects of the situation in Nagaland. In our conversations with Bono, she said something that I've almost never heard from a conservationist in a relatively undeveloped part of the world. She said, "We need more and better roads." Roads are usually the enemy of conservation. Roads go in, wildlife disappears. But her point was if the existing road network in Nagaland were in better shape, that it wouldn't be, like you didn't feel like you were taking your life in your hands, driving in these god-awful roads. If they could more easily bring people in from outside, it would give these communities an opportunity to benefit from tourism. It is an extraordinarily beautiful place, and even though the bird life might have been a little sparser around the villages than I might have preferred, there's a lot there for ecotourism. If it didn't take you 8 to 12 hours to make it's really a relatively short distance that you're driving, it would be an absolute no-brainer to connect visiting Nagaland at the peak of the falcon migration in late October and early November with the opening of Kaziranga National Park in the neighboring state of Assam, which opens at the close of the monsoon season in early November. Kaziranga is one of the crown jewels of Asia's national park system. It's along the Brahmaputra River. It's not all that far from Pangti. It's home to the largest Indian one-horn rhino population in the world. There's 3,000 Indian one-horn rhinos there. When we visited Kaziranga after our time in Pangti, at one point I was standing at an observation point looking out over the floodplain of the river. I counted 59 rhinos in one sweep of my binoculars. And you have wild buffalo and swamp deer and hog deer and wild hogs and wild elephants and an extraordinary range of bird life. Pallas's sea eagles, red-wattled lapwings, giant hornbills. And it would be a perfect match to bring people to Kaziranga and to the Amur falcons. But you're going to need roads, better roads, to get them in there. You don't have to have more roads. There's a lot of other socioeconomic reasons why a better road system in Nagaland would be beneficial for the environment there. And unfortunately, because Nagaland's been trying to break away from the rest of India for something like 80 years, the Indian government has no real interest in pouring money into Nagaland. Nagaland has also been cursed with really corrupt and inept state management. And so I don't know that it's necessarily going to change anytime soon, but I came away with feeling that I agreed with Bono that for the first time in my career as a conservationist and natural history writer, I was kind of rooting for the paving trucks to show up and the road engineers. Every morning we would go down to the watch sites. We'd watch these birds as they departed. They'd spread out across the landscape. We'd see them in small kettles as they were feeding on termites. And then we'd come back in the evening, and particularly the last evening that we were in Nagaland, at low light again, walking through the high elephant grass, finding where elephants had just come through. Earlier that day, left these enormous crushed paths through the elephant grass. It's a little nerve-wracking because Asian elephants can be extremely aggressive and extremely dangerous. Not that last evening, we didn't really see that many falcons. They were kind of lingering wherever they were. We climbed up into the watchtower. We listened to the crickets. We listened to the frogs. We watched the sun go down, and then after dark, as a gibbous moon was rising, these birds started coming in by the hundreds, and then the thousands, and then the tens of thousands. And unlike the morning when there was this susurration of wings, this sense of, like rushing water, it was utterly and completely quiet. These birds gliding in, it was kind of like they were being drawn into a black hole, just coming from every point in the compass to this central point. And even after it was full dark and we could no longer see them, against the disk of the moon, we'd see bip, 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 bip. And I found myself trying, okay, so the disk of the moon covers X percentage of the sky, how many, and I just stopped at that point. Because sometimes you just let science go. Sometimes you just let the numbers wash away. To just stand there in this incredibly remote place, watching this astonishing migration, and to realize that this horrible thing that had been happening had ended, and potentially a new day for these birds had dawned, and potentially a new day for the Naga. It's going to be critical to get tourists in there. And Catherine Hamilton, who was over there with me last year, she and Luke Tiller have a Wildside group in there right now. They just left Nagaland and headed to Kaziranga a couple of days ago with mattresses. We made sure they've got mattresses. And if anybody is feeling adventuresome, I'm taking a group in there next year. And Gus kindly gave me permission. There's some flyers over there. I'm not just trying to hawk an eco-tour trip for an eco-tour company. This is going to be critical for making this whole conservation thing work for the falcons in Nagaland. So if you don't mind muddy roads and landslide zones and potentially sleeping on fairly hard beds in order to see one of the most astonishing raptor spectacles, talk to me afterwards. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I want to thank Gus and everybody else here at the Cornell Lab. It's always such a pleasure and such a privilege to come here, and Fitz, just keep doing what you're doing. Thank you all very much. Do we have time for questions? Gus says we have time for questions. Yes?
Scott, I think you said the Falcons fly 2,400 miles over the Indian Ocean. I realize that it depends upon winds and so on. How many days would it take them?
So Leo's holding up the big sign that says, repeat the question for those on the live stream. This 2,400-mile crossing of the Indian Ocean, how many days does that take them? They've actually put satellite transmitters on Amur Falcons. And in fact, the year they discovered this big slaughter in 2012, there was the first Amur Falcon that had ever been satellite tagged was passing through that area, and Bono and her crew were terrified that it was going to be killed because it would be horrible publicity. And I'm sort of spinning this out because I'm trying to remember how many days it takes. I want to say it's a 2.5 day crossing, but I'll be very honest with you, I forget. We could look it up in the magazine article because it is in there. Constant flight. Yeah, they can't. They're not. There's no thermals out over the ocean, and some of the individual birds, they've now tagged a number of Amur falcons. Some of them take a somewhat more northern route and go across to the Horn of Africa. But and in the springtime, they tend to go a little bit farther, from your perspective, farther north this way. But in the fall, they're generally going kind of across the wide part of the Indian Ocean. Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing. We still don't know what migratory birds are capable of. Every time we think we've got it figured out, they do something else that astonishes us. Any other questions? Yes, Phil.
I'm curious to know what the chances are that the people of Nagaland are going to prosper with what now seems to be a sort of iffy situation as far as ecotourism goes.
So the question is, Phil's wondering, what are the chances that the people in Nagaland are going to prosper with what seems like a fairly iffy situation as far as tourism goes? I don't know. I don't think anybody's going to go back to killing falcons. First of all, it's illegal. It was illegal when they were doing it, but the Indian government had kind of turned a blind eye to it. If they went back to doing it now, it's just the wrath of the world would come down on them. So that's not going to happen. What is happening is actually there are significant concentrations of falcons in other communities in Nagaland. So, some of these other communities are trying to replicate what Pangti is doing, and also we're discovering large concentrations of falcons in some of the other states. So it's becoming more of a regional thing. There was actually an Amur Falcon Festival for the first time in Nagaland this year, because nobody doesn't like a bird festival. Nagaland is also, they've developed a fairly significant tourism industry, a cultural tourism industry in Nagaland. I mean, you have, these large tribal divisions, they all have incredibly beautiful traditional regalia, clothing and headdresses made of hornbill feathers and hornbill casques. There was a huge hornbill festival in early December in one of the larger towns. So the Nagaland, the sort of nascent tourism industry in Nagaland as a whole. There's also a lot of foodie tourism in Nagaland because the cuisine is delicious and very different than the rest of India. So they're starting to coordinate, I think, a little bit more. But the more remote areas like Pangti, it really is going to come down to better roads. But now they have an incentive to try to get those roads fixed up. Yes.
Speaking of the roads, has there been any effort to try to coalesce NGO, international development organizations, to help improve the roads so that they can improve their economy?
So the question is, has there been any attempt to coalesce, NGO and international aid toward getting those roads done? I don't know. I haven't heard of it. I can't say that there hasn't been, but I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. Yes.
I was also wondering about the international development angle. It seems to me that if there were an effort to build roads, then there would need to be some kind of partner. The partner then would be the federal government of India, or the partner would be some kind of state of Nagaland, in your view?
Right. So the question of what partners would be involved in that kind of road work, that's a good question, because the money, as I understand it, would have to come from the Indian sort of national government, and they're not anxious to make that kind of money available to Nagaland because of all the political problems.
For a story like this, it seems that international development organizations, especially because of the ecotourism angle,
yeah,
it would be an idea that could sell back at the World Bank, for example, or Asian Development Bank or something. And so, but there needs to be a partner, and there needs to be there need to be the enabling conditions for the institutions to accept the money and to spend it.
Right. I mean, there's the state of Nagaland has a road department. It's just that they're poorly funded, and I have to say also the conditions are god awful. I mean, they're steep mountainsides. It's extremely rugged terrain to be building roads through. It's not like building roads in New York or Pennsylvania would be. And I wish I knew more about the political situation there as relates to these roads, and I apologize that I don't. No. Yes, David.
You mentioned the falcon as a social creature. How long are they're concentrating in this area? why are they attracted to that area? This is part of the migration movement, right?
Right. Well,
How
so,
long do they stay there? I mean, what are they finding there?
right, so how long are the falcons staying there? We don't really know how long each individual falcon is there, and there's work going on right now to try to answer that. The falcon numbers in most years start building about the second or third week of October. They usually peak around the first week of November, and then some of the birds are there into late November or early December. But whether an individual falcon is there for 2 months or not, I'd be surprised if that turned out to be the case. They're there, of course, because of the termites, because of this enormous flush of termites. We now know that they're wintering in that whole area of Nagaland and Assam and some of the surrounding states into neighboring Myanmar/Burma. What are we calling it these days? I don't know what's the proper term, the proper name. But they're bulking up on these termites. But there's a couple of young scientists, some of them working for the Indian Forest Department, some of them university students. In fact, I'm involved with Hawk Mountain down in Pennsylvania, and we have 2 young scientists, a young conservation biologist with the Indian Forestry Department who's coming to Hawk Mountain as an international trainee in the spring, and a fellow who's working on his master's looking at the diet of Amur falcons. Are they just feeding on termites? What kind of termites are they feeding on? And he'll be coming, I think, spring of 2020 as a trainee at Hawk Mountain to try to give them the tools that they need, the educational and professional tools they need to go back and, the young fellow who's coming next spring is very involved in outreach, working with these communities, and we're going to be teaching him as much as we can about, building constituencies for conservation for raptors in rural communities. So, yes, sir.
Yes, once they migrate down and they get to Africa, they have to bulk back up to go back up. Right?
Yes, yeah. And
what would they be eating down there?
termites.
Same thing.
Eating termites. And in fact, I can't remember the numbers now, but a couple of South African biologists actually calculated how many billions of termites the Amur falcons are eating when they're in southern Africa, because they're arriving down there at the time when the termites are emerging there. So it's kind of like eastern kingbirds leaving here and going to South America for the winter, and then moving across the Amazon basin in sync with local rainy seasons, because that's when the fruit's ripening and they can feed on fruit, because you all know that kingbirds feed on fruit in the wintertime rather than insects. So we see this again and again with migratory birds, where they've created these global networks of movement so that they hit exactly the right place at exactly the right time, where you have these seasonal flushes of food. Now, when they're up on the breeding grounds in Siberia, they're not getting a lot of termites up there, but in India and in Africa, they're feeding on termites. So, yes?
Does their musculature and their organs change, as you've described before, in shorebirds?
That's a good question. I don't think anybody has an answer for that. We missed the opportunity to necropsy a lot of Amur falcons 5 years ago. But it would not surprise me at all. We're finding that many migratory birds undergo profound physiological changes. Now, not necessarily to the same extent that like bar-tailed godwits do, where they basically, most of their digestive system atrophies over the course of a few days. But, most migratory birds, just before they take off in migration, their pectoral muscles increase dramatically in size, their heart muscle increases dramatically in size, and they do that without exercise. Sign me up for that. I want that in a pill. And there are human physiologists working on that. Yes, sir.
Do they nest in trees or on the ground in their nesting?
They nest in low trees and on the breeding grounds, yeah. Often in kind of open, sort of steppe areas, small groves, yeah. They're not in dense forest.
They're not in the tundra.
No, and it's like southern Siberia, so more steppe grasslands and trees. So, all right. Well, I can keep talking about this until your eyes roll back in your head if you want to do it privately. But again, I want to thank you all very much for coming out.
Thanks, Scott, thank you so much. So Scott has agreed to hang out afterwards, so he'll be out here signing books. With that, we're going to conclude the program. Thank you very much for coming out, and thank you very much to our web audience tonight. Thank you very much, Scott.